The next theory of economic discrimination, called the segmented labor markets, is actually three hypotheses altogether. So the segmented labor markets tells us that labor markets are going to be split into two separate parts, which we can clearly identify. The first hypothesis is going to be the dual labor market hypothesis, where the labor market is split into the primary and secondary sectors. The primary sector are essentially jobs that everybody wants. They're high paying, there's opportunity for advancement, it gives you a lot of benefits, that type of idea. The secondary sector is just the exact opposite of that. There's going to be low paying jobs, it doesn't have a lot of opportunity for advancement, you're stuck there forever, and there's not a lot of benefits attached to it. The second hypothesis is the job crowding hypothesis, where occupations are separated into predominantly male and female jobs. So we basically say, hey, this is a male-dominated industry, and this is a female-dominated industry, so what exactly is going to emerge from that? And then finally here, the third hypothesis is the insider-outsider theory, where workers are segregated into union and non-union sectors. So what happens if you join a union? What happens if you don't join a union? What exactly does that mean for wages in each of these sort of sectors? So all three of these hypotheses under the segmented labor markets, they share a very similar supply and demand analysis, and we're going to be focusing in on the dual labor market and a job crowding hypothesis in this particular section, with the insider-outsider theory being its own section because there's a lot that we can detail about unions later on in the chapter. So let's go ahead and take a look at the job crowding hypothesis a little bit more with supply and demand, and also by extension the job crowding and dual labor markets. So on the left-hand side, we have the male-dominated jobs, we have supply and demand, we have the wage rate and industry output for these jobs, and we also have the same on the right-hand side with female-dominated jobs, supply and demand, the wage rate, and the industry output for these female-dominated jobs. So go ahead and think about each of these industries and think about some that are male-dominated and some that are more female-dominated. So what will be a few female-dominated jobs or industries? That's where a lot of nurses would come in, maybe some type of administrative assistants, stewardesses, teachers. These are all very female-dominated jobs where there's more women there than there are men. What would be a few male-dominated jobs? This is where a lot of engineering comes in, construction, logging, a lot of STEM fields as well. These are all more men than there are in women. And also I can go ahead and say that you could probably lump in economics as a male-dominated job. If you ever take higher level econ classes, you'll notice that there's a lot more men than there are women. And if you go into graduate studies in economics, the ratio gets even worse. There's like 8 guys for every girl in there. It's absolutely terrible. It's probably one of the reasons why I'm going to die alone, choosing the wrong major. So just let that be a warning to you guys. So let's go ahead and assume that some type of discrimination happens in these male-dominated jobs. So for some reason, the male-dominated jobs within this particular subset say, hey, we don't want this particular group of people within these male-dominated jobs. And it doesn't really matter. We'll just say, hey, this group of people, we don't want them in here. And what exactly is that going to do within the labor market if they discriminate against a particular group of people? That is going to help to reduce the supply of workers or laborers in the male-dominated job industry. And when we have a decrease in supply in the labor market, what is that going to do for the equilibrium wage rate and equilibrium output? That is going to raise the wage rate from WE to W1 and reduces the industry output for these male-dominated jobs. But there is going to be some type of implications for other jobs as well. So the group of people that was just discriminated against, they can't find jobs in the male-dominated field, so where are they going to have to go? They have to go to other industries and other jobs, and one area they can go to are the female-dominated jobs. So there's more people that are going to go and find jobs in the female-dominated industry. And what exactly is that going to do for the supply of labor there? We notice that, hey, the supply of labor is going to increase from S0 to S2, and what does that do to equilibrium wage? We notice the wage rate goes down from WE to W2, and industry output is going to increase. So before, we were at an equilibrium wage of WE for both of these jobs when no discrimination was happening. So every single person was being paid the same exact job wage rate in each of these jobs. But when discrimination actually happens, we notice that, hey, the male-dominated jobs, they have an increase in their wages, but the female-dominated jobs, there's a decrease in their wages, And that is exactly the type of wage gap that we may see incurring nowadays. So here, male-dominated jobs, they have a higher wage than the female-dominated jobs, and that is the wage gap when discrimination may happen. So discrimination, as we can see in this supply and demand analysis, it leads to a wage gap of W1 minus W2. So discrimination leads to a wage gap, of W1 minus W2. So here, when discrimination actually occurs in one particular industry, that has wide-reaching effects on industries all around. And here, a wage gap does emerge. So one question that we may want to ask ourselves is, how exactly can we get rid of this wage gap? Is there some way that we can lower the wages in the male-dominated jobs or increase the wages on the female-dominated jobs? And once again, that's where supply and demand analysis comes into play. Most importantly, on the demand side for both of these particular industries. So let's go ahead and detail the analysis out of that. So let's go ahead and draw up both of these curves. Let's see if we can do this equally with one another. So here we have supply and demand, supply, and this is going to be our equilibrium original point. So point A, WE, and we can just, we don't worry too much about the output, so don't worry about that. And this is for the males. And then we have, for the females, the same thing, demand, supply, and at point A, this is exactly where WE is going to be once again. So once again, starting off, both the males and females in both of these industries are earning the same exact wage. But what happens when some type of discrimination occurs? On the male side, that's where the supply decreases because they are no longer opening up their labor market to every single person. So this is S1, and that causes that wage to increase to W1. But as the people that are discriminated against, that causes them to go find jobs elsewhere, and that's where they go to the female-dominated jobs, and the supply is going to increase there to point B, and that's exactly where that wage gap of W1 minus W2 is going to emerge. So W1 here minus W2. So one question that we are going to want to ask is, what can help to reduce this wage gap? So question that we ask is, what can reduce the W1 minus W2 wage gap? And as we mentioned, it's going to have to deal with some type of demand analysis right here. So what can we do on the demand side on the male industry and on the female industry to help reduce this wage gap of W1 minus W2? One thing that we can do is on the male side, we can help to reduce demand. So here on the male side, number one, reduce demand for these particular jobs. And when we reduce demand, where does that lead us? It leads us right here from D to D1, so shifting the demand curve inwards towards the origin, and that is going to lead us at point C, and at point C, that gets us back to our original equilibrium wage rate of WE, and our wage gap is now smaller. It's now WE minus W2 rather than W1 minus W2, which is a larger difference. On the female side, we can also hit demand by increasing demand for these particular fields. So increase demand here. Increase demand. So on the female side, we can increase demand. On the male side, we can reduce demand. And when we increase demand on the female side, we shift our demand curve away from the origin. And what does that do for us? It leads us to a new wage of WE once again. So here, this is D1. If we extend this out just a little bit further, that's at point C, and we get back to our equilibrium wage of WE once again. So here, one way to reduce the wage gap is to focus in on the female side and increase demand for the female-dominated jobs in this industry. And finally, the last thing that we can do is combine both of these together where we have a combination of both of them. So here, number three, a combination of reducing demand on the male-dominated industry and increasing demand on the female-dominated industry. And that, once again, can help reduce this W1 minus W2 wage gap. It's a little bit easier said than done in this instance because, as we've noted, there are a lot of determinants of supply and demand, and they are all working with and against one another, as we've noted in any type of market that we have taken a look at. And one way that we can help to reduce this wage gap is to focus on the government a little bit more. And that's why there's a lot of public policy to help reduce this type of discrimination, or to sort of preserve the equal wages for equal work type of idea. And that's exactly where we see a lot of public policy to combat discrimination. There are a lot of laws that have been passed. So we'll go through these pretty quickly. Remember that I'm not a big fan of history, but we have the Equal Pay Act of 1963, which requires that women and men receive equal pay for equal work. And then every single law and act passed after this is going to add an extra layer. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibits discrimination based on race, color, sex, religion, or nationality. Executive Order 11246 establishes affirmative action, a little bit controversial and still is nowadays. Then we add in the Age Discrimination Act in Employment of 1967. Then we add in disabilities in 1990. And then there's the Equality Act, which would prohibit discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender identity. And this is something that has been proposed for quite a few years already. And we'll see if this is going to be added in as a public policy to combat discrimination. So our second model of discrimination, as we built this up, the segmented labor markets, focusing in on the job crowding hypothesis and the dual labor markets, and we'll focus in on the insider-outsider theory with unions in the next few sections. I'll see you guys there.